7 marriages, 5 women. One of the most explosive, brilliant, and self-destructive men in the history of American comedy. Richard Pryor didn't just perform chaos, he lived it. He married women he loved and hurt them. He married women he barely knew. He married the same woman twice, and then did it with another woman too. He was shot at, sued, left for dead, and still managed to make the audience laugh. The story of his marriages is the story of a man who couldn't escape the damage he carried, no matter how many times he started over. Peoria and the making of a wounded man. Before there were 7 marriages, there was a boy in Peoria, Illinois, who grew up in circumstances that would have broken most people permanently. Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor was born on December 1st, 1940, in Peoria, Illinois. He was raised in a brothel. His grandmother, Marie Carter, ran the establishment. Not just one, but eventually 2 brothels, along with a nightclub and a pub on Peoria's North Washington Street. His mother, Gertrude Thomas, worked in the house as a prostitute. His father, Leroy Pryor, acted as a solicitor for the operation, the person who brought in clients. This was not a rough neighborhood used as metaphor. This was the literal structure of the household Richard Pryor grew up inside. A business built around the sale of intimacy, staffed by family members, operating in the specific social ecosystem of a mid-century Midwestern red light district. He was one of several children in the household. He witnessed things that no child should witness. In his autobiography, Pryor Convictions, he described himself as a skinny little black kid with big eyes that took in the whole world, and a wide smile that begged for more attention than anyone had time to give. The description is precise. He was a child trying to be seen in an environment organized entirely around other things. His mother eventually left when Richard was around 5 years old, fleeing his father's violence, and custody was awarded to his father. There was a period in 1948 when he lived with his mother and her family in Springfield, but ultimately he returned to Peoria and his grandmother's household. His mother disappeared from his life when he was around 10 years old. His father died in 1968. His grandmother, Marie, died in 1978, one of the deaths that hit him hardest, because she had been the one consistent figure in a childhood with very little consistency. He described in interviews over the years the specific quality of growing up in that environment. The way he learned to read a room from the time he could walk. The way he absorbed the social dynamics of a working house. The way love and money and fear were all circulating in the same space. He escaped into movies. The local cinemas were one of the few places a boy could go to be somewhere else entirely. And he learned to make people laugh, which was the one skill that worked reliably in nearly every situation his world presented. His grandmother caught him performing a small show for the local kids one afternoon and, rather than punish him, enrolled him in a talent program at a community center. She saw what was there. She was the first person to recognize it formally. He was expelled from school at 14. He worked as a janitor, a meat packer, and eventually joined the army in 1958. The army, as it turned out, was not a better environment for him than Peoria. He spent much of his service in an army stockade following an altercation with a fellow soldier. He was discharged in 1960, returned to Peoria, and had a child on the way. The first marriage was about to begin. Patricia Price, The Beginning. Richard Pryor married Patricia Price in 1960 or 1961. The exact year is recorded differently in different sources, with IMDb placing the marriage date as June 11th, 1961. He was 20 years old. Their son, Richard Pryor Jr., was born on April 10th, 1962. The marriage lasted approximately 1 year, and ended in divorce in 1966 per some records, though most accounts describe it as ending very shortly after it began, a marriage that was essentially over before his son was born. Very little has been documented publicly about Patricia Price beyond the basic facts. She was not a public figure, did not give extensive interviews about the relationship, and has largely remained outside the detailed biographical record that surrounds every other aspect of Pryor's life. What is known is that she was the first wife, that the marriage was brief, and that it began at a moment when Richard was just beginning to figure out who he was and what he was capable of, which meant, practically, that she was present for the very early version of someone who was still forming rather than the fully realized force he would become. Richard Jr. grew up knowing his father, but the relationship was shaped by Richard's near-total absorption in his career, his substance use, and the general turbulence of a life that left very little consistent space for fatherhood. Richard Jr. has spoken in interviews about the specific experience of being the son of a man whose public identity was enormous and whose private attention was inconsistently available. Loving when present, but not always present. Richard Pryor left Peoria after the marriage ended and moved toward New York, where he intended to build a comedy career from nothing. He had essentially no money, no connections, and no guarantee that anyone would care what he had to say. He performed in small clubs in Greenwich Village and Harlem, worked through material night after night, slept on floors, and spent the early 1960s developing the voice that would eventually make him the most important stand-up comedian of his generation. He worshipped Bill Cosby in the very early years and consciously imitated his clean, polished style, the safe, palatable comedy that had made Cosby one of the first black comedians to cross over to mainstream white audiences in a significant way. For a while, Pryor worked in that mode, wearing it like a costume. Then, in a much-told moment at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas in 1967, he stopped midway through a performance, looked out at the audience, and walked off stage. He had understood in that moment that the comedy he had been doing was someone else's, that it was a performance of a personality that wasn't his, and that if he was going to do this at all, he was going to have to do it from somewhere real. He went away for a period. He went to Berkeley, California, where the counterculture and the civil rights movement and the black arts movement were all happening simultaneously and loudly. He absorbed it. He came back with material that was entirely, unmistakably his own. He was also, throughout this period, developing the habits that would complicate every relationship he had. The drinking that had been part of his life since his teenage years was becoming heavier. Drug use was becoming more regular. The emotional volatility that the Peoria childhood had built into his nervous system was being amplified rather than moderated by success and by substances. And somewhere in all of it, the pattern of his relationships with women was crystallizing into something specific: intense attraction, genuine feeling, then the eruption of whatever he was carrying, and then the end. The next marriage would begin as he was reaching his first real period of fame, and it would end much sooner than it should have. Shelley Bonus. The fame years begin. By 1967, Richard Pryor had built enough of a career to be performing regularly at major venues and appearing on national television programs. He had done The Ed Sullivan Show. He was being noticed and compared to Bill Cosby, whose polished, mainstream-friendly style Pryor was already consciously moving away from. Pryor wanted something rawer, more personal, more willing to look at the actual interior of a black man's life in America without softening any of it. The material he was developing would eventually become the most influential body of stand-up comedy in American history. But in 1967, it was still forming, and the man performing it was simultaneously brilliant and deeply unstable. He married Shelley Bonus in 1967. Some records place the formal beginning of the marriage in January 1968. Their daughter, Rain Pryor, was born in July 1969, and the marriage ended not long after. Rain has written and performed about her childhood extensively, most notably in a one-woman autobiographical show that she developed and performed over many years. Her account of growing up as Richard Pryor's daughter was honest about the love alongside the pain, the way he could be warm and present, and then, in different circumstances, entirely inaccessible. She described a father who was deeply funny, genuinely curious, physically affectionate at his best. And then the drugs would shift everything. The man she knew in the warm moments was not always the man who was there. Rain also grew up navigating the specific complexity of being biracial in a period when that wasn't always comfortable. With a famous black father and a white mother, in a world that had strong and not always kind opinions about what that meant. She has been candid about those aspects of her childhood in interviews and in her autobiographical work, and her portrait of Richard Pryor as a father was full and unsparing, and also full of love. The Shelley Bonus marriage also produced one of the recurring dynamics of Pryor's personal life. He was involved with other women while married. His relationship with Maxine Anderson produced a daughter named Elizabeth Ann, born April 24th, 1967, the same year he married Shelley. The children arrived across multiple simultaneous relationships, which was a pattern that would continue through most of his adult life. By this point, cocaine had entered his life in a serious way. Alcohol had always been present. The combination of genuine creative genius, enormous professional ambition, the emotional volatility that came from his childhood, and substances that stripped away whatever limited internal regulation he possessed, was producing a man who was simultaneously making some of the most important comedy of the era and methodically dismantling his personal life. He had a well-documented breakdown in Las Vegas in 1967, walking off a stage mid-performance and disappearing for a period, that was connected to both the substance use and the deeper crisis of identity he was going through about what kind of comedian he actually wanted to be. The answer he came back with, after the breakdown and a period of recalibration in Berkeley, California, where the civil rights movement and the black arts movement were happening simultaneously and loudly, was the comedy of his actual life. Not the polished imitation of Bill Cosby, not the safe material that crossed over to white audiences without friction. The comedy of the brothel, and the grandmother, and the father, and the fear, and the drugs, and the specific experience of being a black man in America, told with an honesty that the industry and much of the audience had never encountered before. That Nigger's Crazy, in 1974. Is it something I said? In 1975. Bicentennial Nigger in 1976, which won a Grammy Award. These albums were rewriting what stand-up comedy could be, how personal it could get, how honest, how willing to examine the interior of a life without softening the edges for anyone's comfort. The live concert film, Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, was released in 1979 and is considered by many comedy scholars to be the single greatest stand-up comedy performance ever recorded. The divorces and the arrests were the tabloid story. The comedy was the actual story. They were inseparable from each other because the same damage that fueled the work's honesty was the damage that made his personal life so consistently difficult. After Shelley, there was a period before the next official marriage. But those years were packed with relationships, affairs, and a nearly uninterrupted stream of personal chaos that made the marriages themselves look almost tidy by comparison. One of the most significant non-marital relationships of his life happened in 1977. Pam Grier, Deborah Maguire, and the chaos of 1977. Pam Grier was, in 1977, one of the most celebrated actresses in America, known primarily for her roles in the action films of the early 1970s that had made her a cultural phenomenon. She and Pryor were cast together in Greased Lightning that year, and what developed between them was genuine and intense. Grier has spoken about the relationship with a combination of affection and clear-eyed honesty. She loved him. She recognized that he was damaged in specific and deep ways, and she tried to help him, most notably helping him work through reading difficulties connected to his complicated educational history, sitting with him and going through material patiently in ways that the biographies of both of them have noted. She saw who he was underneath the performances and the substances. She was also, as she eventually acknowledged, unable to save him from himself. That is not a criticism of her effort. It is a description of his condition. While he was in a relationship with Pam Grier, he married someone else. Deborah Maguire was an actress and model whom Pryor had been involved with on and off for roughly 4 years before they married on September 22nd, 1977. She was described by people who knew them as genuinely in love with him, someone who accepted the difficult parts of who he was because the man she experienced at his best was remarkable. She was not uninformed about the territory she was entering. She knew about the drug use. She knew about the volatility. She entered anyway. The marriage to Maguire lasted approximately 4 months before one of the most dramatically public incidents of his personal life. On New Year's Eve of 1977, a party at their Northridge home ended in spectacular fashion. An argument erupted, guests began leaving, and Pryor, in a state of chemically fueled agitation, took his gun outside and fired multiple rounds into the cars of guests who were still in his driveway. The cars were empty by the time he started shooting, as most of the party had already scattered. But the sound of gunfire in a residential neighborhood at midnight on New Year's Eve was enough to bring the police. He was arrested on charges of assault with a deadly weapon. The charges were eventually reduced, and the legal proceedings unfolded across 1978. But the incident was widely covered and became one of the defining public images of his personal chaos. Not because it was the worst thing that ever happened in his private life, but because it was the most visible, the kind of thing that ended up on the news and in the papers, and that people remembered decades later. He later told People magazine that he didn't know why he did self-destructive things like that he wanted to learn from his mistakes. It was a statement that was, by all accounts, entirely sincere. The wanting to learn was real. The learning itself was considerably more difficult. Maguire's account of the marriage, given to People shortly after their separation, described the fundamental problem with precision. Richard Pryor couldn't argue. He would let things accumulate until the pressure became unbearable, and then he would explode. A lot of things were said in anger that were going to be very hard to smooth over. The divorce was finalized in August 1978, and she subsequently filed suit against him in connection with events of their time together. What was happening in parallel, underneath all of the personal chaos, was the comedy, That Nigger's Crazy, in 1974. Is It Something I Said? In 1975. Bicentennial Nigger in 1976, which won a Grammy Award. These albums were rewriting what stand-up comedy could be, how personal it could get, how honest, how willing to examine the interior of a black man's experience in America without softening the edges for anyone. The live concert film Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, was released in 1979 and is considered by many comedy scholars to be the single greatest stand-up comedy performance ever recorded. The divorces and the arrests were the tabloid story. The comedy was the actual story. They were inseparable from each other because the same damage that fueled the work's honesty was the damage that made his personal life so consistently difficult. The next woman who would try to love him was someone he hired to decorate his house. Jennifer Lee, The First Time and the Fire. Jennifer Lee was an actress and interior designer. Richard Pryor hired her to redecorate his home sometime around 1980, and in the proximity of that professional arrangement, something genuine developed between them. She was sharp, direct, and capable of holding her own with someone whose force of personality tended to dominate every room he occupied. She understood what she was getting into, at least intellectually. Understanding and living are different things. She moved into his world at the worst possible time, in the worst possible way. In June 1980, Richard Pryor set himself on fire at his home in Northridge, California. The circumstances of exactly what happened that night have been described in various ways over the years. Pryor himself told the story differently at different moments, sometimes framing it as a freebasing accident, and sometimes implying, in darker and more candid moments, that something more intentional may have been happening inside him that night. What is documented by the medical record is that he was badly burned, burns covering more than half of his body, and that he ran down Parthenia Street in the San Fernando Valley with his clothing on fire before being stopped and helped by passing motorists. He was hospitalized at the Grossman Burn Center at Sherman Oaks Hospital, where he spent 6 weeks undergoing treatment that included skin grafts and reconstruction. The physical ordeal left him permanently changed in his relationship with his own body. He recovered, and he made comedy about it, which was, for Richard Pryor, the only available response to any experience he actually survived. His 1982 concert film, Richard Pryor, Live on the Sunset Strip, included a sequence about the fire that became one of the most celebrated pieces in his catalogue. The moment when he described the experience of burning and then running, told with such specific and fearless honesty that audiences watching it simultaneously felt they were witnessing something deeply personal and laughing harder than they had any right to. The bit about the burning match and what it said to him in that moment has been analysed and quoted and performed as an example of what comedy can do when it's operating at its highest level. He and Jennifer Lee married in August 1981, approximately a year after the fire. By all accounts, she entered the marriage with genuine love and genuine awareness of the territory. She was not naive about who he was. She had watched the public record. She had seen the chaos. She chose him anyway, which says something about both her capacity for love and what she saw in him that was worth choosing. The marriage lasted approximately 14 months. They divorced in October 1982. The stated reason was his drug addiction, which had not abated. The freebasing that had led to the fire was not a one-time event, but the continuation of a pattern, and the sustained presence of that pattern inside a marriage made the marriage impossible to sustain. Jennifer Lee later described the experience with characteristic directness. The addiction was the third person in the marriage, and it took up all the room. But she did not disappear from his life. She remained connected to him in the years that followed, not as a wife, not exactly as a friend, but as someone who was woven into who he was in ways that outlasted the official designation. She would return. He would need her. In the meantime, there were more relationships and more marriages ahead, including a woman he would marry twice in rapid succession. Flynn Belaine, Twice Around. Flynn Belaine was an aspiring actress when she came into Richard Pryor's life in the mid-1980s. Their relationship began before any official commitment, and in November 1984, she gave birth to their son, Stephen, 2 full years before they formalized anything. The child arrived into the world of a man who was already a father multiple times over, in various configurations of involvement and distance. The first marriage to Flynn Boleyn took place in October 1986. It ended after approximately 2 months. Flynn filed for divorce, then withdrew the petition, a sequence that suggests the relationship had the specific quality of something that neither party could fully commit to ending, even when they were trying to. The on and off nature of what they had was built into the structure of how they operated. The divorce was finalized in July 1987. While all of this was happening, the filing, the withdrawal, the finalization, Richard Pryor fathered a son with another woman. Franklin Pryor was born in April 1987 to a woman named Geraldine Mason, making him the child of a relationship that overlapped with the marriage to Flynn. Franklin arrived 3 months before the divorce from Flynn was finalized, which provided a very specific timeline of events that speaks for itself. Flynn Boleyn gave birth to their daughter Kelsey in October 1987 after the divorce was finalized. So the second child she shared with Richard arrived after they were legally separated. This is the kind of biographical detail that requires no editorial commentary. The facts carry their own weight. Richard Pryor and Flynn Boleyn remarried on April 1st, 1990. The date carries its own irony. The second marriage lasted roughly 15 months, ending in July 1991. The reconciliation and the second dissolution followed the same basic arc as the first, with neither version of the marriage lasting long enough to resolve whatever it was that kept pulling them together and driving them apart. In 1986, Richard Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He did not announce it publicly until 1991, meaning he lived with that knowledge for 5 years, privately, while continuing to make films, marry and divorce Flynn twice, and manage the steady physical deterioration that the disease was beginning to produce. The timing of the diagnosis, coming at a moment when the cumulative physical toll of his life was already significant, meant that the MS was entering a body that had already been through the fire and the drugs and the fundamental damage of decades lived at maximum intensity. By the early 1990s, he was no longer capable of the physical dynamism that had always been part of his performance. The disease was advancing. His last stand-up special had been in 1983. The film career continued through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Jojo Dancer, Your Life is Calling, in 1986, which he directed and which was autobiographical in a way that his public had come to expect. Moving in 1988, Harlem Nights in 1989. But the work was increasingly dependent on his name and his presence, rather than the full expression of the force he had once been. He suffered a heart attack in 1990, the same year he remarried Flynn for the second time. He underwent triple bypass surgery. His body was telling him something in increasingly urgent terms about the cost of how he had lived, and he was finally, in a different way than before, running out of the capacity to ignore it. The marriages had ended. The career was in a different register. And Jennifer Lee was still in his life, in the way that people who are truly connected to us remain present even when the official relationship has concluded. Jennifer Lee, the final chapter. Richard Pryor and Jennifer Lee remarried on June 29, 2001. He was 60 years old. She was 53. The multiple sclerosis had advanced significantly by this point. He used a wheelchair for mobility, required substantial assistance with daily life, and the man who had dominated stages and screens and the imagination of American comedy for 4 decades was now living with the particular, relentless humbling of a progressive neurological disease. The decision to remarry him was, by Jennifer's own account, not a complicated one. She had loved him since 1980. The intervening 20 years had not dissolved that. She had watched the Flynn Boleyn marriages happen. She had watched his health deteriorate. She had remained connected to him in various ways through all of it. When the question finally resolved itself into whether she would be the one beside him for whatever remained, she said yes without apparent hesitation. She managed his care, his affairs, and his legacy with a ferocity that became itself a defining characteristic of the final years of his life. She was his primary caregiver. She made decisions about his public representation. She gave interviews on his behalf when he was no longer able to give them himself. She was, in the truest practical sense, the person who kept the machinery of his life running during the years when he could not run it himself. The marriage was also, by the accounts of those who visited and knew them in those years, genuinely warm, not a duty, not a business arrangement. Richard in a wheelchair, Jennifer beside him, the two of them watching films or having conversations or simply being in the same room. People who saw them together described something real rather than something performed. The chaos that had defined the first marriage in 1981 was gone, replaced by the specific intimacy of two people who had known each other a long time and understood each other in ways that didn't require explanation. She also became, after his death, a controversial figure in the management of his estate and his legacy. She had strong views about what recordings should be released, which projects should be approved, and how his work should be presented to new generations. Those views put her in conflict with his adult children and other members of his family at various points, and the disputes generated press coverage and legal proceedings. The ferocity with which she protected what she considered his legacy was not always appreciated by the people who also had a claim on it. But the ferocity came from love rather than from calculation, and the distinction matters. Richard Pryor had a significant heart attack in 1990 and survived. He had another in 2005. On December 10th, 2005, 9 days after his 65th birthday, he had a third and final heart attack at his Los Angeles home. Jennifer was present. She attempted to revive him before emergency services arrived. He was transported to a hospital and pronounced dead at 7:58 in the morning. He was 65 years old. He had been married 7 times. He had 6 surviving children. He had made some of the most important comedy in the history of the form, and he had been, by the accounting of almost every person who had loved him, one of the most difficult human beings any of them had ever known. What the marriages meant. Richard Pryor's biographer, Scott Saul, who wrote Becoming Richard Pryor, offered a description of the pattern in his relationships that was precise and unsentimental. The closer women came to him, the more ugliness they often experienced. Just as he had lived in fear growing up, he had learned in childhood that love and harm were tangled together, and he never quite managed to separate them in his adult relationships. That was the inheritance of the brothel on North Washington Street in Peoria, of the grandmother who loved him and hit him, of the parents who left. This is not a defense of any harm done to anyone. The women who were close to him experienced real things, real fear, real legal proceedings, real scars that did not require psychological explanation to be taken seriously. Patricia Price, who was married to him before anyone outside Peoria had ever heard of him, and raised their son largely without him while he went and became a legend. Shelley Bonus, who gave him reign and navigated the impossible territory of being close to him as his career exploded into something neither of them had fully anticipated. Deborah Maguire, who watched him fire a gun into empty cars on New Year's Eve, and then went to court over what had happened in their time together, and who told People magazine afterward that Richard Pryor just couldn't argue, that he would wait until something got under his skin so badly that he blew up, and that a lot of things had been said in anger that were going to be very hard to smooth over. Jennifer Lee, who married him in 1981 with full knowledge of the territory and discovered that full knowledge and daily experience are not the same thing, who then left and came back 20 years later, because whatever he was, she couldn't stay away from it. Flynn Belaine, who married him twice and had 2 children with him, and navigated the specific chaos of a man who was fathering a child with someone else while they were married. Each of these women entered the relationship knowing something about the difficulty and discovered more once they were inside it. What they also all apparently encountered was something real at the center of Richard Pryor, that the performances and the substances and the volatility were partly covering and partly expressing. His comedy was autobiographical in the most literal sense. He told stories on stage about his grandmother's brothel, about his father, about his marriages, about the fire, about the drugs, about race and love and death and fear. He told all of it because all of it was true, because he had no other mode of processing his experience than to hold it up to the light in front of an audience and see what it looked like. And what it looked like, in his hands, was the most honest comedy that anyone had produced. The 7 marriages were part of that autobiography. They were the record of a man who wanted connection with a kind of desperation that went back to the 10-year-old boy who was left behind in Peoria, who grew up in a house where love was available but always conditional, always tangled up with something else, always subject to withdrawal without warning. He kept trying to build something stable with other people. He kept finding that the damage he carried was too deep and too active to allow it. He was also, in the spaces between the wreckage, genuinely capable of love. The people who knew him when the substances were not overwhelming him described someone warm and perceptive and unexpectedly gentle. Funny in private in a way that was different from the stage version, curious about people, physically affectionate in the particular way of someone who grew up with very little reliable physical warmth. Rain Pryor's account of her father made room for both the difficulty and the love, because both were real and present, and neither one cancels the other. Jennifer Lee's decision to come back in 2001 was not made by someone who had forgotten what happened in 1982. It was made by someone who had weighed the full account and chosen him anyway, because the full account also included everything he was at his best, and that was worth something that couldn't be easily named. He made Richard Pryor live in concert in 1979, which many scholars of comedy consider the single greatest stand-up performance ever committed to film. He made Live on the Sunset Strip in 1982, in which he described setting himself on fire with such precise and fearless honesty that the audience didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and ended up doing both simultaneously. He made Here and Now in 1983, his last major stand-up special, which showed a man already beginning to feel the approach of physical limits he couldn't perform his way out of. Between those 3 films, captured at different points in a decade of extraordinary chaos, was the full portrait of what he was. A man who could take the worst thing that had ever happened to him and make an audience feel it and laugh at it and understand something they hadn't understood before. These were the actual stakes of the story, not just who he married and when, but what he was making while all of it was happening, what the damage cost him and what he made from the cost. Every marriage produced more material. Every divorce produced more material. The fire produced material that millions of people have watched and laughed at and been moved by for decades. The suffering was real, and the art made from the suffering was real, and the 2 facts exist simultaneously without either one diminishing the other. The comedy scholar and biographer Scott Saul described Pryor's personal life and his professional life as inseparable, that you could not understand why the comedy was so extraordinary without understanding what was fueling it, and you could not understand the chaos of his private life without understanding that the same raw, undefended access to his own experience that made the comedy devastating was also the thing that made him impossible to be safely close to. He couldn't put up walls for the comedy and walls for the relationships at the same time. He was either open or closed, and when he was open, everything came through. Richard Pryor grew up in a brothel in Peoria and couldn't finish a marriage for most of his adult life, and set himself on fire and hurt people he loved and made them laugh and made America think more clearly about race and pain and humanity than almost anyone before him. He died on a December morning in Los Angeles with his wife beside him, having tried to save him. She was the woman he had married first in 1981 and again in 2001. The one he kept coming back to. The one who kept coming back to him. 7 marriages. One love story interrupted. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She was called the most beautiful woman in the world. Louis B. Mayer signed her to MGM after a single conversation. Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy competed for roles alongside her. A United States patent she co-filed in 1942 would eventually become one of the foundational technologies behind Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. She was also married 6 times, 6 different men, 6 different endings, and by the time her life was over, she was alone, reclusive, and largely forgotten by the industry that had made her a legend. What happened between all of that is a story about a woman who was too much of everything, too beautiful, too smart, too restless, for anyone she ever married to fully hold. This is the story of Hedy Lamarr's 6 husbands. Vienna and the making of Hedwig Kiesler. Before there was a Hedy Lamarr, there was a girl named Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler, born on November 9th, 1914, in Vienna, Austria, the only child of Emil Kiesler, a successful bank director, and Gertrude Lichtwitz Kiesler, an accomplished pianist who had grown up in Budapest. The Kieslers were a prosperous Jewish family living in one of the most culturally rich cities in Europe, and they gave their daughter everything that a comfortable Viennese upbringing in the 1920s could offer: private tutors, music lessons, wide reading, fluency in multiple languages, and the kind of intellectual atmosphere that makes a certain kind of mind expand rather than contract. Vienna between the wars was a city that took ideas seriously. Psychoanalysis, modern architecture, the philosophy of the Vienna Circle. And the Kiesler household was connected to enough of that world to give Hedwig a genuine early education. Emil Kiesler was particularly devoted to his daughter. He took her on long walks around Vienna, explaining how things worked, how a printing press functioned, how a tram's engine moved the car forward, how the mechanisms beneath everyday life were ordered and logical if you understood them correctly. Hedwig absorbed all of it with the focused attention of someone for whom understanding how things worked was not an obligation but a genuine pleasure. She had, from childhood, what her adult friends and colleagues would describe decades later as an engineer's mind, the instinct to look at any system and immediately begin thinking about what its weaknesses were and how they could be addressed. It was not a common quality in anyone. It was an especially uncommon quality in a young woman in the Austria of the 1920s and 1930s, where the educational and professional world had a very specific and limited idea of what a clever girl was supposed to do with her cleverness. She also had a face that stopped rooms. By her early teens, she was being noticed in Vienna for reasons that had nothing to do with her father's banking connections or her mother's musical accomplishments. She was tall and dark-haired, with a quality of physical presence that was immediately striking, and that the camera, when she finally encountered it, understood and reproduced with what seemed like enthusiasm. She discovered theatre at around 14 and began pursuing it with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. She found her way into the orbit of director Max Reinhardt, one of the most significant theatrical figures in German-language Europe, and studied with him in Berlin. At 17, she appeared in a small German film called Geld auf der Straße in 1930, her first professional screen appearance, a minor role that nonetheless confirmed something she already suspected about herself. The camera was a place where the two things she had, the face and the mind, could work together rather than in competition. More parts followed through 1931 and 1932. She was building a career with deliberate speed, and by the time she was 18, she was already on a trajectory that could lead, for a young woman of her appearance and ambition in the Europe of the early 1930s, in one of two directions: a significant film career or a very significant marriage. In 1932, she received an offer to appear in a Czech film directed by Gustav Machati. The film was called Ecstasy. It would change everything, and not entirely in the ways she had anticipated. Ecstasy and the Consequences. Ecstasy was released in 1933 and caused a scandal that spread across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic. The film included a scene of Hedwig Kiesler swimming without clothing, and another extended scene that generated considerable controversy regarding its content. The film was banned in multiple countries, condemned by the Catholic Church, and Adolf Hitler reportedly ordered all copies destroyed. Pope Pius XI also publicly condemned it. What it also did was put the face of Hedwig Kiesler on the front pages of newspapers across Europe, which brought her to the attention of a very specific and very powerful man who had been looking for a wife. Friedrich Mandl, known as Fritz, was 30 years old in 1933, significantly older than Hedwig, and he was one of the most formidable industrial figures in Austria. He owned the Hirtenberger Patronenfabrik, a munitions and weapons manufacturing company that made him one of the primary suppliers of ammunition to various European governments. His business connections extended to Benito Mussolini, to Austro-fascist political figures, and to the networks that were reshaping European power in the years before the Second World War. He was Catholic, despite having partial Jewish ancestry that he actively downplayed, and he moved with the confidence of a man who understood that in the Austria of the early 1930s, wealth and political connections were the only currencies that mattered. He pursued Hedwig Kiesler with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to acquiring things he wanted. He sent gifts, arranged introductions through mutual acquaintances, and was persistent in ways that the social structure of their world made it difficult for a 19-year-old actress to simply refuse. She was 19 when they married, on August 10th, 1933. He was 30. Her parents were not enthusiastic. Her father, Emil, was deeply uncomfortable with the match from the beginning, but they were in no practical position to prevent it. What followed was, by Hedwig's own detailed account in her 1966 autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, a marriage that was spectacular on its surface and suffocating beneath it. Mandl was obsessive in his possessiveness. He attempted to purchase every existing print of Ecstasy, which he found intolerable given its content, spending significant sums on buying up copies he could destroy. When he discovered he couldn't buy them all, he turned his attention to controlling everything about his wife instead. She was not permitted to go out without him. She was not permitted to have friendships he hadn't pre-approved. She was watched by household staff. Her correspondence was monitored. He took her to his business dinners, where she sat at tables with arms dealers, fascist politicians, and military officials, listening to conversations that she had no formal training to understand, but that she absorbed with the particular attentiveness of someone with genuine curiosity about how things worked. She later said the dinners were educational. She was sitting in rooms where men were discussing torpedoes and radio-controlled guidance systems and the vulnerabilities of military communications technology. She was absorbing information about munitions and weapons manufacturing. She was paying attention in the way she had always paid attention, as someone for whom understanding a system was natural and automatic, and for whom the gap between the current state of something and an improved version was immediately visible. She was also increasingly afraid. Mandel's control had moved beyond restrictive into something closer to confinement. The warm, intellectually expansive girl who had walked the streets of Vienna with her father, discussing how machines worked, was now a possession kept in an extraordinary house, displayed at dinners, and prevented from having any meaningful independent life. She began, quietly and carefully, planning her escape. The escape. The precise details of how Hedwig Kiesler left Friedrich Mandel in 1937 have been told in different versions over the years, with the most dramatic involving her disguising herself as a maid to slip past the household staff who monitored her movements. Whether that specific detail is accurate or was embellished in various retellings, what is documented is that she did leave Austria, that she made her way to Paris and then to London, and that aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic, the Normandy, she found herself seated at dinner near Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful man in Hollywood. Mayer was traveling back to the United States after a European talent scouting expedition, doing what the major studios regularly did in that era, looking for European actors who could be polished and presented to American audiences. When he encountered Hedwig Kiesler at dinner and understood who she was, he made an offer. By her account, the initial offer was insulting, something in the range of $125 a week, a figure that bore no relationship to what she was worth or what she intended to accept. She went back to her cabin, thought carefully about who she wanted to be in America and what terms she was willing to work under, dressed with deliberate care, and returned to Mayer's table. By the time the ship reached New York, she had a contract that paid $500 a week with structured escalations that would take the figure significantly higher. She was 23 years old, and she had negotiated a studio contract aboard a transatlantic ocean liner with one of the most powerful executives in the entertainment industry. She had also secured a new name. Mayer suggested Lamar, after the silent-era actress Barbara Lamar, who had been called the most beautiful woman in the world. Hedwig Kiesler became Hedy Lamar. The old name, and everything it carried, was left in the wake of the Normandy. She arrived in Hollywood in 1937, and within months was starring opposite Charles Boyer in Algiers, the film that introduced her to American audiences as something they had not quite seen before. She was not simply beautiful in the conventional Hollywood sense of the era. She had a quality of intelligence on screen, a watchfulness, a sense of active thought happening behind the eyes, that the camera captured and that audiences responded to with an immediacy that surprised even the studio. Reviews described her as magnetic, as hypnotic, as unlike anything currently working in American films. The studio had acquired something commercially extraordinary. It had also acquired something it had very little framework for understanding or managing. Because the thing about Hedy Lamar, the thing that no studio system of that era had any real mechanism for accommodating, was that she was considerably more than the face they were marketing. Jean Markey and the Hollywood beginning. Her second husband was nothing like her first. Jean Markey was a screenwriter and producer who moved comfortably in the upper tier of Hollywood's social world. He was literate, witty, well-traveled, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that made him interesting company without making him particularly deep. He had been previously married to actress Joan Bennett and, later, to actress Hedy's eventual contemporary Myrna Loy, which gave him a specific social credential in the Hollywood community of the late 1930s and a demonstrated pattern of being attracted to remarkable women. He and Hedy were married on March 4th, 1939, and the marriage had a glamorous surface entirely in keeping with the MGM star system's sense of how its leading people were supposed to live. The marriage lasted 2 years and was, by most accounts of those who observed it, more of a social arrangement than a genuine partnership. They were well matched at the level of dinner parties and industry events, and the general performance of Hollywood coupledom in the studio era's golden age. Beneath the performance, the compatibility was considerably more limited. Marky was charming, and Hedy was extraordinary, and the combination worked at parties. But a party is not a marriage, and the daily life of their shared household did not sustain what the social life projected. Marky's infidelity was one reason the marriage collapsed. Hedy's restlessness was another. She was not, by any account of her character, someone who could maintain the performance of contentment when the reality underneath it was something else. She had spent 4 years performing contentment for Fritz Mandel, and she did not have another 4 years of that in her. During the marriage, they adopted a son named James. The circumstances of James's origins were not straightforward. He later claimed as an adult to be Hedy's biological child by a relationship outside the marriage, an assertion that complicated the family record and was never definitively resolved. Hedy never publicly confirmed the specific claim in full detail. What is perhaps more significant than the marriage itself was what Hedy was doing in the hours she was not performing for cameras or attending parties. She had installed a drafting table in her home. She had begun, systematically, to think through technical problems that interested her. She had never stopped being the girl who had listened to her father explain mechanisms. She had never stopped processing the information absorbed at Mandel's dinner tables, where the men who built weapons had talked about their limitations without ever imagining that the decorative young wife of their host was filing every technical detail away. In the early years of the Second World War, with German submarines threatening Allied shipping and the limitations of radio-controlled guidance systems becoming a military problem of genuine urgency, she had identified something that she believed could be fixed. The problem was simple to state. A radio signal sent to guide a weapon could be jammed by broadcasting on the same frequency and overwhelming the communication. If you knew what frequency the guidance signal was using, you could disrupt it. Her solution required frequency hopping, rapidly changing the frequency of the radio signal in a synchronized pattern between the transmitter and the receiver, so that both ends of the communication were always on the same frequency, even as that frequency changed dozens of times per second, making jamming effectively impossible. She developed the concept in conversation with her neighbor, George Antheil, a composer who had worked extensively with player piano rolls and who understood the mathematical problem of synchronizing two mechanical systems across time and distance. They filed a patent on August 11th, 1942. United States Patent 2,292,387 described what they called a secret communication system. The Navy declined to implement it during the war. The prevailing view was that the electronics required were too bulky for the weapons of the era. The patent expired in 1959. Hedy received no compensation. And then, as electronics miniaturized across the following decades, the technology she had conceived was adopted by military communication systems, then commercial systems, then the consumer electronics, that would eventually mean that virtually every wireless device on Earth was, in some technical sense, using principles she had described in a California kitchen during the Second World War. She received nothing for it during the decades when it generated the most value. The recognition, when it finally came, arrived late enough that it felt more like a correction than a reward. But in 1941, with the marriage to Marquis dissolving and the patent 2 years away from filing, what she was thinking about most was the next chapter. John Loder and the children. Her third marriage was her longest and, in certain respects, her most consequential for the shape of the rest of her life. John Loder was a British actor, tall, classically handsome, with the easy manner of an English gentleman who had navigated Hollywood without losing his sense of who he was outside of it. He had appeared in a substantial number of films through the 1930s and 1940s without ever quite achieving major stardom, which placed him in a curious position relative to Hedy. He was a professional peer in category, but not in scale, a working actor sharing a household with one of the most recognizable women in the world. They married on May 27th, 1943, after Hedy's short-lived involvement with Jean Marquis had concluded and the patent had been filed. The marriage lasted 4 years. The children were the most significant product of the union. Denise Hedwig Loder was born in 1945, and Anthony John Loder arrived in 1947. The same year the marriage ended, which tells you something about the internal chronology of how things were going. Anthony has spoken, in various interviews over the decades, about his mother, with a combination of genuine love and honest complexity. He described a woman who was brilliant, beautiful, and often elsewhere, not absent in the simple sense, but present in ways that were oriented towards something other than the daily rhythms of raising children. The household was maintained by staff. Hedy's career was maintained by MGM. The connection between mother and children was real, but conducted often through layers of practical mediation. The divorce was finalized in 1947. Loder's accounts of the marriage, given in subsequent years, described a man who had been genuinely in love with someone he could never quite reach. Someone whose attention was always, on some level, somewhere else. The children, the household, the professional life, all of it was present. But Hedy's interior world was operating on its own schedule, one that the domestic arrangements of married life could not fully contain. Loder went on to live a quieter life in England after the marriage ended. He and Hedy did not maintain a close relationship. The career was also beginning to show the first signs of the slowdown that would define the 1950s. She had made significant films through the mid-1940s, Tortilla Flat in 1942, The Heavenly Body in 1944, The Strange Woman in 1946, and she would make one of her best-remembered appearances as Delilah in Cecil B. DeMille's Samson and Delilah in 1949. But the particular kind of European glamour she embodied was becoming familiar rather than fresh. She had turned down roles she would later regret. The film Gaslight was offered to her before it went to Ingrid Bergman. Strategic decisions made at the peak of her commercial appeal did not serve her as well as she had hoped when the peak was behind her. She was 32 years old in 1947. She had 3 children. She had 3 divorces. She had a patent sitting unimplemented in Washington. 3 more marriages remained, and the longest was still ahead. Teddy Stauffer and the brief Swiss interlude. Teddy Stauffer was, in almost every measurable way, the least significant of Hedy Lamarr's 6 marriages, least significant in duration, in legacy, and in the extent to which it seems to have mattered deeply to either party involved. He was a Swiss musician and former bandleader who had built a second career as a hotel and nightclub owner in Acapulco, Mexico, where he had become a significant figure in the expatriate social scene that flourished in the town during the late 1940s and early 1950s. He was known in those circles for his charm, his easy social manner, and his ability to move between worlds without apparent difficulty. He was the kind of person who seems more interesting in a bar overlooking the Pacific than he turns out to be in a marriage. They married in 1951. They divorced in 1952. The marriage lasted approximately 10 months, produced no children, and left very little documentation of what occurred between them. In the limited interviews Hedy gave about her marriages over the years, the Stauffer chapter was mentioned with the brevity it probably deserved, a connection that had seemed to promise something and delivered considerably less. She had been in her mid-30s, between careers and between husbands, and Stauffer had been in the vicinity and had seemed appealing in the way that things sometimes seem appealing when you are between things. What the Stauffer marriage does represent, in the broader arc of her story, is a pattern that had by now become visible to observers, even if Hedy herself could not always see it from inside. She moved toward commitment quickly and away from it almost as quickly, engaged each new relationship with what appears to have been genuine hope, and discovered, with each one, that the particular combination of needs and expectations she carried was one that no man she encountered could sustain over time. She was 40 years old as the Stauffer marriage dissolved. She had been famous for over a decade. She had 3 children in various arrangements of care. She had a patent sitting on a shelf in Washington that nobody was doing anything with. She had 4 marriages behind her, and the money from MGM was not as abundant as it had been. She was also still, by every account of those who saw her in person, startlingly beautiful. Her 5th husband would be the one who lasted the longest. W. Howard Lee and the longest chapter. William Howard Lee was a Texas oil executive, prosperous, grounded, and possessed of the steady certainty that comes from building something real in an industry that rewards patience and practical intelligence. He was not a glamour figure. He did not have ambitions in the entertainment industry, and no interest in being absorbed by the demands of Hedy's career. He was not a particularly complicated man, and after the accumulated complications of her first 4 marriages, this was apparently appealing. He was, in the terms of what she appeared to need at that particular moment, a stable and substantial presence who could provide the financial and emotional security that the previous 5 marriages had not sustained for long. They married on December 22nd, 1953, and the marriage lasted until 1960, 7 years, which by the standards of her personal history was an almost remarkable length of time. The Texas oil money was real, the stability it offered was genuine, and for a period, Hedy stepped back from the relentless public exposure of her Hollywood peak years. She was still recognizable and still sought after for public appearances, but the frantic energy of the MGM era had given way to something quieter. She and Lee split their time between Texas and California. She appeared less often in major productions. The specific commercial pressure of being a leading MGM actress was lifting. She was also, through these years, continuing to think and to invent. She had ideas, multiple ideas, pursued with varying levels of rigor, that she would sometimes sketch out in notebooks and sometimes develop further with engineers and designers she encountered at social gatherings. She conceived a fluorescent dog collar to make pets visible at night. She worked on a modified traffic light system. She had ideas about tablet-based carbonation for drinks that preceded similar commercial concepts by years. Whether any of these would have produced significant results if pursued with the discipline she had applied to the frequency hopping patent is impossible to know. But what they demonstrate is that the mind was always active, always looking for the next problem worth solving, always restless in a way that no external circumstance of her life had ever fully contained. The Lee marriage ended in 1960. The specific reasons were never publicly detailed, which itself suggests they were ordinary rather than dramatic. She was 45 years old, had been married 5 times. and was approaching the final chapters of her Hollywood career with the particular combination of resources and regrets that a life of her scale tends to produce. Her financial situation had become increasingly precarious. The habits of living she considered appropriate were expensive, and her career was no longer generating income at anywhere near the rate of her peak years. One more marriage remained. Louis Boys and the Final Attempt. Louis J. Boys was a lawyer from New York. He and Hedy Lamarr married in 1963, when she was 48 years old. The marriage lasted 2 years and ended in 1965. She sued him for divorce on the grounds that he was more interested in her fame and connections than in her as a person. A complaint that, given her 30 years of accumulated experience, carried its own particular weight. The boys' marriage coincided with the period of Hedy's autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, which was published in 1966. The book was written with the assistance of ghostwriters, and its contents were considerably more explicit and personal than she had anticipated, or so she maintained after publication. She sued her co-authors and the publisher for what she said was a misrepresentation of the material and of her involvement in the final text. The lawsuit was eventually settled, but the episode added to the general turbulence of a period that was becoming increasingly difficult in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She also sued director Mel Brooks in 1974 for including a character named Hedy Lamarr in his Western comedy Blazing Saddles without her permission or compensation. The case was settled out of court. She reportedly accepted the settlement with a dry remark about what Brooks should have paid her, which was entirely in character. The shoplifting incidents that generated press coverage in 1966 and 1991 need to be understood in the context of a woman whose financial situation had deteriorated significantly from the heights of her studio years and whose relationship with the public world had become increasingly fraught. The 1966 arrest at a Los Angeles department store was eventually dropped. The 1991 incident in Florida, when she was 76 years old, was similarly disposed of without conviction. But both were covered with a prurience that said more about how the media treated women who had once been celebrated than it said about anything factually significant. She was, in her final decades, living inside the gap between who she actually was and who the world had decided she had been. These incidents, the shoplifting, the lawsuit, the public humiliations of a career in full retreat, need to be understood in the context of the specific and documented problem of cosmetic surgery. Hedy had begun having procedures done in the 1950s and 1960s, and by the late 1960s and 1970s, the accumulated results had begun to distort rather than preserve. She became increasingly unwilling to be photographed, increasingly reclusive, increasingly protective of the privacy that had once been impossible for her to maintain. The beauty that had been both her greatest asset and her most complicated burden was now the thing she was hiding. The last years and what was finally recognized. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s, Hedy Lamarr had retreated from public life almost entirely. She lived in apartments in New York and then in Florida, kept to herself, communicated primarily by telephone, and maintained a small circle of contacts rather than the vast social world she had once inhabited. The beauty that had been both her greatest asset and her most complicated burden had become, in the final decades of her life, a source of acute anxiety rather than confidence. She had begun having cosmetic procedures done in the 1950s and 1960s, and by the late 1960s and 1970s, the accumulated results had begun to distort rather than preserve. She became increasingly unwilling to be photographed, increasingly reclusive, increasingly protective of a privacy that had once been almost impossible for her to maintain. She wore enormous sunglasses in public on the rare occasions she appeared. She cancelled interviews that had been arranged. She preferred the telephone to any situation where her appearance was visible. She developed a close friendship with her son, Anthony Loder, who visited her regularly and became one of the most consistent presences in her final years. He later described those visits with evident affection. A mother who was still sharp, still curious, still capable of conversation that ranged across subjects with genuine speed and intelligence. The mind had not diminished. The restlessness had not diminished. What had changed was her relationship with the world that had always looked at her and seen primarily a face. She occasionally gave telephone interviews, a format she preferred precisely because it did not require her to be visible. In one such interview, she talked about her invention with a combination of pride and bitterness that was entirely warranted. She had conceived what became a foundational wireless communications technology. The Navy had taken it up and used it. The commercial world had taken it up and generated enormous value from it. She had received, across those decades, essentially nothing. The shoplifting incidents that generated press coverage in 1966 and again in 1991 were reported with a prurience that said more about how the media treated women who had once been famous than it said about anything factually significant. The 1966 arrest at a May Company department store in Los Angeles on suspicion of stealing merchandise worth roughly $86 was eventually dropped. The 1991 incident at a drugstore in Florida when she was 76 years old was similarly disposed of without conviction. But the coverage both times had the quality of a public shaming, of a tabloid industry that found something satisfying about a fallen icon being escorted through a booking process. The Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her its Pioneer Award in 1997. She was 82 years old and accepted by telephone. The citation described what she had contributed to modern communications technology: the spread spectrum principles, the frequency hopping, the secure communications that her patent had anticipated by decades. She said, in the brief conversation, that she was pleased someone had finally noticed. Hedy Lamarr died on January 19, 2000, at her home in Castleberry, Florida. She was 85 years old. She was alone, no husband, no regular companion, the children present in her life, but not under the same roof. She had requested that her ashes be scattered in the Vienna woods. A return, at the end, to the city where Emil Kiesler had walked his daughter through the streets, explaining how the world worked before any of it had happened. Anthony Loder carried out her wish. He took her ashes to Austria and returned them to the woods she had asked for. The girl from Vienna, who had become the most beautiful woman in the world and one of the uncredited architects of modern wireless technology, went back to where she had started. The city of Vienna officially honored her in 2014, naming a section of street after her, Hedy Lamarr Gasse, in the district of Döbling. She had been dead for 14 years by the time her city formally acknowledged what she had been. What the 6 marriages meant. 6 marriages, 1 patent that changed the world, 3 children raised in varying configurations of presence and distance, a career that burned at its brightest between 1938 and 1949, and then faded as the studio system that had created it shifted toward different kinds of beauty and different kinds of stories. A final quarter-century of increasing retreat. And then, at the very end, recognition that arrived almost too late to feel like much more than a correction of a long oversight. What the marriages of Hedy Lamarr tell us, across the full arc of the story, is something about the specific difficulty of being a person who cannot be contained by the categories available. She was beautiful, and the world of her era had a fully developed system for processing beautiful women. They married wealth, or they became film stars, or ideally both. They were photographed and managed and scheduled and packaged. The system was not designed to accommodate the simultaneous fact of genuine technical invention, of an engineer's mind operating alongside the actress's face, of a restless intelligence that found every domestic arrangement eventually insufficient. The studios understood what to do with her face. They did not understand what to do with the rest of her. Each husband encountered a different facet of who she was, and found it, in its own way, too much to hold. Fritz Mandl tried to possess her, and found it was not possible. She was observant enough at his dinner tables to understand weapons systems she had no formal training for, and determined enough to plan and execute an escape from a life that was destroying her. He had thought he was acquiring something manageable. He was not. Jean Markey charmed her and did not hold her attention long enough to understand what she was actually thinking about at the drafting table she had installed in her house. John Loder gave her children and a home, and could not give her whatever she was still looking for, the specific thing she needed from a partner that none of the six managed to fully provide. Teddy Stauffer was a pleasant detour that lasted 10 months and left very little trace. Howard Lee gave her stability for 7 years. Before that, 2 proved insufficient, in ways that neither of them apparently articulated clearly enough to fix. Louis Boys gave her 2 years before she concluded he was interested in what she represented, rather than in who she was. She was, through all 6 marriages, fundamentally the same person. Too curious to be comfortable, too restless to be satisfied, too aware of her own intelligence to pretend that any arrangement that did not honor it was one she could sustain for very long. The patent, which she received no money from and which is now embedded in technologies worth hundreds of billions of dollars in commercial value, is the clearest single image of what her life actually meant beyond the marriages and the films. She had sat at a weapons manufacturer's dinner table as a teenager in Vienna, listened carefully to conversations she was not supposed to understand, and spent the following decade quietly working out a better solution to a problem the military establishment had not solved. She had filed the patent. She had been ignored. The technology had been used anyway. The money had gone elsewhere. And 50 years later, every time anyone connects a device wirelessly, they are in some sense using a principle she thought of first in a California house during a marriage that lasted 2 years. She was married 6 times and received the most significant recognition of her actual contributions by telephone at the age of 82. She gave her best idea to a world that didn't compensate her for it, and she continued to have ideas anyway, until the end. That is the story of Hedy Lamarr's 6 marriages, and the woman those marriages could never quite contain. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.